Okay. Hi everyone, I'm John Padron, Solutions Architect and CJIS Compliance Specialist at DSM. Welcome to part 3 of our 4-part series on CJIS Compliance in the cloud. Today, I'll be focusing on topics related directly to CJIS Cloud Compliance. Before we get started, I want to summarize what we've discussed so far. In part 1, we've discussed an overview of CJIS history, terminology, concepts, and scope. And in part 2, we discussed the agreements and policies you must have in place, and I've highlighted some of the major ones to focus on. In this section, we'll be discussing the following topics: overview of CJIS cloud vendor requirements, cloud documentation and steps towards compliance, 2 methods to become CJIS compliant in the cloud, working with non-sponsored vendor, and working with a lead agency sponsored vendor. Let's begin with an overview of CJIS cloud requirements. Many have asked, can an agency in the cloud be CJIS compliant? Per CJIS policy section 2.2, the simple answer is yes. The reason being is that the CJIS security policy is a device and architecture independent. So as long as the cloud vendor is able to meet the existing requirements of the CJIS policy, you can go ahead and proceed. And that brings us to an important point. Cloud vendors must meet many of the same CJIS compliance requirements as agencies. Ultimately, the agency is held responsible to ensure their CJIS data and the solutions are compliant. But any qualified and experienced CJIS cloud vendor should be able to provide documentation and easily explain how they are able to support and maintain your compliance. Now let's discuss some of the basic requirements needed to use a cloud vendor. First, all of the cloud vendor data centers and support personnel must be located in the continental US. Second, the prospective cloud vendor must be willing to perform a fingerprint-based background check on all employees that will have unescorted access to unencrypted CJIS data or systems. Lastly, the vendor must be willing to submit to multiple site surveys and audits by not just your agency or lead agency sponsor, but by your state CSA and FBI as well. Next, let's discuss the documentation steps needed to begin your journey into a CJIS compliant cloud. When attempting to place CJIS data or systems in a cloud environment, you really have 2 options. Work with a non-sponsored cloud vendor or work with a lead agency sponsored vendor. We'll cover the difference between these 2 types of vendors shortly. So once you've determined which vendor you want to work with, the next steps require submission of the proposed cloud solution to your state CSA. In Florida's case, the Florida Department of Law Enforcement for pre-approval. This documentation includes an official request letter to use a cloud vendor detailing the type of solution signed by the agency head, a completed cloud implementation plan, a network diagram of the solution, a FIPS 140-2 certificate of all encryption modules leveraged for the solution, and finally, all pertinent policies from the vendor, including their media, incident response, and data center escort policies. The CSA will review and then either approve or ask clarifying questions about the solution. You should not proceed until the CSA has given you the go-ahead. Next, let's discuss the difference between working with a non-sponsored cloud vendor versus a lead agency-sponsored cloud vendor. With a non-sponsored cloud vendor, the agency must perform the site survey of all the vendor's data centers, perform the fingerprint background check of all vendor employees themselves. This method can be time-intensive and could potentially significantly delay a CJIS cloud project. With lead agency-sponsored cloud vendor, the time-consuming work of performing data center site surveys and fingerprinting of the vendor's employees has been completed for you by the lead agency. So what is a lead agency sponsor? Simply put, a lead agency sponsor is a criminal justice agency that has obtained permission from the CSA to sponsor a cloud vendor. In addition, the agency must be an existing client of the cloud vendor to fulfill this role. So by working with the lead agency sponsored cloud vendor, you just need to sign a memorandum of understanding, an MOU, between your agency and your lead agency sponsor as part of the pre-approval process. For more information on the steps you'll need to follow, you can go to the link on your screen and check out our CJIS checklist. Well, that's it for part 3. Join me next time as I cover some additional cloud topics, as well as getting started with CJIS in the cloud. See you then.